Okay, let's get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's literary Zoom lecture brought to you by Wilton Library. I'm Michael Bellicosa, Community Engagement Manager here at the library, and I'm very pleased to be introducing this lecture, which is made possible with the support of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. Because we have a large audience, we'll handle the Q&A at the end as follows. You can send me your questions using the Q&A button, and I'll relay them to Mark after his lecture. And Mark is also happy to answer questions that you can email him directly later after the program and before next week. Mark Schenker has been at Yale College since 1990 and is currently a Senior Associate Dean of the College and Dean of Academic Affairs. A former lecturer in the English department at Yale, he received his PhD from Columbia University with a concentration in 19th century and early 20th century English literature. For over 30 years, Dean Schenker has lectured on literature and film and has led book discussion series in more than 100 venues in Connecticut, including public libraries and retirement communities, museums, and cultural centers. He's been back with us for at least a couple of years now, and we love his programs, look forward to having him back for more, and we've got a lot to cover, so with that, I'm turning it over to Mark.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for attending. The question that this series is addressing is what was included in the materials. What's Victorian about the Victorian novel? So unlike the recent programs I did on the Iliad or the Odyssey or Joyce's Ulysses that were very geological, that is diving down into the text over multiple meetings, this is more of a topographical survey where we are using the novels, 4 novels by 4 authors, 2 men, 2 women in the order of their publication, all great novels, not just great Victorian novels, to talk about the age in terms of its cultural, intellectual, and literary aspects. So I want you to keep that in mind. Today, I am going to be talking about Jane Eyre, but I also hope to give you some tools, some things to focus on as we go through the 4-part series. So let me say that for many years, I've taught a course in libraries called Imagined Women. Jane Eyre and Tess have both been featured in that, which talks about what makes these literary characters seem both absolutely realistic in terms of the conventions of their time, and in what ways are they imagined? That is, what does the literary text do to make them different from just a woman who might have lived in history? And I'm going to be doing some of that this month. So the first thing I want you to keep in mind about the period is the near hegemony of middle-class values. Victoria and Albert were monarchs with very middle-class tastes. As the middle class rose in the 19th century and the upper classes receded in their influence, class supplanted rank. That's an important consideration. Rank, you're born into it, and unless there's an unusual circumstance, you're going to die in it. But class, by its very definition, is fluid. The middle class is always rising until 2008. You might have read the papers. The nature of class system is to try to avoid falling and to try to rise. That is very much a central feature of the Victorian age. As that happens, appearing to be a gentleman may matter more than being one. Having money might be more important than having true manners, that is, having breeding. And that's going to be an important issue in several of our novels. People who appear to be gentlemen, in most cases it's a male, and are not. In our mutual friend Dickens' last novel, published after Great Expectations, published in 1865, there's a nouveau riche couple who use their wealth to buy their way into society. Some in the period referred to this broadly as the gospel of getting on. Dickens would both mock it and enact that in his own life. Here's what he has to say in chapter 10 of that novel about what in Victorian culture and society had taken the place of old values. Have no antecedents, no established character, no cultivation, no ideas, no manners. have shares, capital letter S, that is parts of an investment. Have shares enough to be on a board of direction in capital letters, oscillate on mysterious business between London and Paris, and be great. Where does he come from? Shares. Where is he going to? Shares. What are his tastes? Shares. Has he any principles? Shares. What squeezes him into Parliament? Shares. Perhaps he never of himself achieved success in anything, never originated anything, never produced anything. What then? Sufficient answer to all: shares. This notion that you can become important, that you can have class because you have money, is going to matter in nearly all of these novels. It's central to Great Expectations, and we should not miss that part of Jane Eyre's success at the end of this novel, despite her goodness, despite her good fortune about the fire and the communication with Rochester by telepathy, which is what it is, she also has money at the end of the novel. And if she didn't, they wouldn't have the marriage we presume they're going to have. So keep the middle class, the centrality of marriage and family, and the idea of respectability over true value in mind during these lectures. Another thing to keep in mind, at the end of the 18th century in England and elsewhere, Romanticism came into dominance as a reaction to the Enlightenment's focus on reason, on common sense. Again, I'm talking in broad cultural terms. You'll forgive me that I have about 45 minutes each for these 4 novels. In response, the Romantics praised and investigated uncommon sense, the imagination, and the many aspects of human enterprise that transcend reason: fairy tales, myths, coincidences, supernaturalism, spookiness. And so we have in the last decades of the 18th century and well into the 19th and beyond, an interest in the pleasures of literary terror that became associated with primitive feelings and extremes of emotion as a kind of catharsis. As middle-class life, as bourgeois life, as industrial urbanized life became more rote, people liked the escapism of a good scare. It was associated also with the Middle Ages and with castles, with Europe, with mystery and even horror. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein at the early end of the 19th century and Bram Stoker's Dracula at the late end are prime examples. And in the middle, here in America, the work of Edgar Allan Poe. But middle class and mid-Victorian readers wanted their Gothic, what I just described about that kind of spookiness, they wanted it light. It was a way of bringing the unreal into the conversation without suggesting that one actually believed in anything supernatural, let alone the Christian religion as a fact, not a savior who walked on water or rose from the dead. Keep a kind of domesticated Gothic in mind during this series. Literary realism, but lots of Gothic. In Jane Eyre, the Red Room, the brooding darkness of Bonfield Manor in general and of Rochester in particular, and of course the eerie but wholly real madwoman in the attic. It may be fantastic, coincidental and hard to believe, the novel's loaded with coincidences, but none of it's supposed to be supernatural. It's all supposed to be factual. So keep that notion of domesticated Gothic. It's in every one of the novels that we're doing. On another front, many in the period wanted to believe in something beyond this terrain, this dimension, but felt they couldn't. George Eliot, the author of Middlemarch, was fond of quoting the prayer of the agnostic. The word agnostic first appeared in English in 1869, and the prayer was written by a writer, a French Victorian named Ernest Renan, R-E-N-A-N. "Oh God, if there is a God, save my soul if I have a soul." The result is a kind of cultural anxiety that is very much a feature of the period. Keep this cultural anxiety in mind. The word angst became popular in English in the 1940s as a result of the works of Freud translated into English. But the word is first used in the 19th century in German by our friend George Eliot, who uses it in 1849. Anxiety is a great deal, plays a great role in the literature and the culture of the period. This anxiety results in a book like Dickens' A Christmas Carol, published in 1843, in which a miserly man is transformed on Christmas Eve by the visits of four spirits. You have to remember his old partner, Marley. But none of those spirits has any connection to conventional Judeo-Christian beliefs. And the man, Scrooge, the miser, is saved in part because of the intervention of a child, but it's not the Christ child. Indeed, Christ is not even mentioned by name in a book called A Christmas Carol that takes place on Christmas Eve in a Christian country. It was first told in December of 1843 when Dickens hoped it would be popular as a Christmas present. The trajectory of A Christmas Carol becomes a model for many later Victorian novels by Dickens and others. It examines the harshness and impoverishment of life. It skirts with tragedy for most of its length and morphs into a comic ending only in the final pages. As with Frank Capra's film, It's a Wonderful Life, 1946, which owes a clear debt to Dickens' novel, if you would have missed the last few minutes of the film or the last few pages of the book, you might be inclined to take your own life. It's incredibly grim. It's a Wonderful Life spends most of its time about anxiety and angst and snaps it around at the end. That model of descending into tragedy, but turning out all right, reader, I married him, is the pattern in many Victorian novels. Not all four that we're reading this season, but we'll see how that works. How does it happen that it turns out so well? Well, as Tom Stoppard and Mark Norman have more than one character say in their screenplay Shakespeare in Love, 1998, it all turns out well. And when someone asks the question, how, the reply in the movie is, I don't know, it's a mystery. And that's said several times in that great movie to great comic effect. Keep in mind that notion that it all turns out well, but nobody knows why. It's a mystery. Keep that in mind when we consider today how Jane Eyre's doleful history ends well, as does Dorothea Brooks in Middlemarch. But don't get too assured. Things do not end well for Pip, and even less so for Tess Durbeyfield. Why? It's a mystery. I'm not being coy now. It's a mystery because the age does not believe it has access to divine providence or divine intervention. One of the things that happened between the 18th and 19th century in the novel is that in 18th century fiction, there are many funeral scenes, many burial scenes where the last time a family or a community takes leave of the departed is actually through a ritual that has some religious or social dimension to it. But the 19th century switched to the deathbed scene, which is common in many novels, including those by Dickens. Mrs. Reed dies in this novel. And the difference between a deathbed scene and a cemetery scene is the difference between being family-centered and not having confidence in ritual or rite or redemption, and keeping up the appearances that a church or chapel or cemetery gives extra comfort. These things are mysteries in these novels because people want to believe that things happen because of a reason. They don't want to think that Darwin's right, that it's all just chance, but somehow they can't bring themselves to take the leap to believe in orthodox, in this case, Christianity. So Jane Eyre is published in 1847. Jane is an orphan, 10 years old at the start. We should note that Pip, 7 years old at the start of his novel, is an orphan in Great Expectations. And Dorothea Brooke, although an older teenager, is also an orphan. One of the ways you know that something is important, in this case family, is when fractured or distorted distorted versions of it are presented. So family matters in these novels. And the reason you know that it does is these heroes, these challenged heroes, and I use that for both male and female, are at a disadvantage in terms of not having parents. Tess is not, in fact, an orphan, but she's certainly not well parented. So Jane Eyre, as with Great Expectations, is a coming of age novel. Very common in all literature, but especially common in the 19th century because people became interested. If you could not study biblical history, if you did not have confidence that the course of human events is improving and we're getting on to a better world, you became more and more focused in the trajectory of your own life. So Great Expectations and Jane Eyre are both first-person narrated novels by the children and later the adults who the novel is about. In each case, the central character is both the narrator and the hero. That's going to matter because one of the things we have to take on faith is that Jane Eyre knows when she's telling her story everything that's happened by the end of the book. She knows that Rochester was married. She knows who Bertha is. She knows that she's going to marry him and have a son. But she withholds that to create herself as a kind of narrator who's also an author. That is not just telling the story and telling everything she knows, but shaping it and withholding it. This kind of autobiographical fiction and actual autobiography, David Copperfield, Dickens is a first-person narrated novel. Many autobiographies in the period. Walt Whitman in America at mid-century writes a long poem, his masterpiece, called Song of Myself. An intense interest in trying to figure out if history does not have evidence of salvation, if you cannot believe that we are destined to be saved, maybe you can find meaning in the pattern of your own life. So she's 10 at the outset, Jane, and the plot takes her through what may be seen as a series of stations in the woe-beset trajectory of her life. Like Tess, this is a novel that is interested in locations also influencing the stages of the hero's life. So we see her early Dickensian childhood in Gateshead Hall with the abusive Reed family. At one point early in the novel, she's struck in the head by a book. It's emblematic of the not just brutality, but the lack of education of the Reeds, that they would wound her with a book. She gets some bleeding. She acts out from their point of view, and she's taken to the Red Room. And the Red Room is called that both because it's suffused with red, but it has a suggestion, a Gothic suggestion of death and spookiness. I use spookiness as a quite legitimate word. She's worried that the violent grief she has of being punished without desert will awaken the spirits of the dead. And she's horrified at that. There's a good Gothic sequence, second chapter of the 37 or 38 chapters of the novel. Even if, she says, those spirits come to comfort her, she'd be too unnerved to be happy. And she asks herself the question, why was I always suffering, always browbeaten, always accused, forever condemned? Tess, at the end of her novel, or near the end of her novel, is sitting outside or lying outside of a crypt that contains the remains of the family that she thought she was related to, the D'Urbervilles of the title. And she asks herself, why am I on the wrong side of this door? Why am I not dead? One of the questions we will encounter time and time again is, what is the nature of human suffering? Why is it in so many of these novels, people have to be put through the ringer, make more wrong choices, suffer, and maybe get a chance at a second choice? There's an answer to that, not just that it's a mystery, that I'll suggest to you next time when we talk about Great Expectations. But that issue, her asking, why was I always suffering, always browbeaten, always accused, forever condemned? There are great comic Victorian novels. Pickwick Papers is one. There's a good deal of comedy in Places and Great Expectations. You have to look long and hard for comedy in Tess or Middlemarch or Jane Eyre. There is a drama and a melodrama to the period that is trying to engage literarily the issue of why is there so much suffering. She moves on then to Lowwood School, where the word Lowwood is suggestive of not having enough logs to keep the school warm. And there we see the utter mistreatment of Jane and other poor girls that is the more striking because unlike the circumstances in the Reed's home, this is not a private matter or a localized issue. This is a perversion of institutional charity, as with Dickens' Oliver Twist. That kind of outrage, which people are more likely to indulge in reading a novel than in actually doing something about in their own public life, is a very big feature of the 19th century novel. When Pip is given an impossibly meager portion of gruel to eat and he wants more, and the children who are experienced in the place, more experienced than he, even though he was born there, tell him, you can't question it. This was decided, the amount was decided by the board, by which the other boys mean a board of trustees. Pip, in his wise innocence, not Pip, I'm sorry, Oliver, thinks that the only way something could decide on so little food is they must mean an actual board. That is a block of wood, because no human being, let alone a collection of charitable human beings, would ever give so little food. That's the horror of moving from the Reeds to Lowwood School. It's now become a socially endorsed impoverishment. And worse, Mr. Brocklehurst, the headmaster, like so many Victorian villains, major and minor, is a hypocrite, allowing his own daughters to live in luxury while he stints on the people he is professionally and morally obligated to serve. Well, after 7 years or so as a student and 2 as a teacher in Lowwood, Jane leaves there to serve at about the age of 20 as governess at Bonfield Hall, where she falls in love with Edward Rochester, the mysterious but attractive lord of that manor. He is given often as a kind of ideal example of the Byronic hero. If that characterization is unknown to you and you're interested, I invite you to look it up. You'll find, I'm sure, online an instructive short explanation. But she visits the dying Mrs. Reed and learns in quick succession that she's inherited a sizable fortune from her uncle and that Rochester wishes to marry her rather than the haughty Blanche Ingram. It would seem that Jane's history is going to end happily until the reader notices that there are 12 more chapters to the novel, and so this cannot be true. In the melodramatic way of so many novels, I'm sorry, I'm hearing some music, I don't know where it's coming from. In the melodramatic way of so many novels, Jane learns on her wedding day that there is, quote, an impediment to her marriage to Rochester. He has, quote, a wife now living. So that kind of aha moment, that kind of remarkable intervention and timing is part of the feature of the Victorian novel. If you don't like impossible coincidences, you can't read Charles Dickens. If you don't like that this novel partly resolves itself through an exchange of telepathic messages, you're not going to enjoy the Victorian novel. It's their way of finding emotion, drama, even an element of passion in the sense of zeal or religious belief in a world that is increasingly devoid of religion. So being a moral young woman, not being willing to live essentially as Rochester's mistress, not buying his argument that he's married to a woman who is so impaired, it's not a true marriage. She leaves Bonfield and winds up at Moore House, accidentally, coincidentally, with the Rivers family, And I feel that Charlotte, as good a writer as she is, was stuck on the R page of her address book, the Reeds, Rochester, the Rivers. But in any event, there she finds out eventually they're related. St. John Rivers becomes attracted to her and proposes that she accompany him as his wife on his missionary work in India, and she declines. And here we see that Jane Eyre is not just a coming of age novel, which it is, but a choice of life novel. How shall Jane live? What shall she do? Whom should she marry? And I'm going to pause for a moment to say what's remarkable about that is that most coming of age novels in the 18th and 19th century are novels about young boys becoming men. They are not about women, girls becoming women, because in the actual social realities of the time, women didn't have a choice of life. They couldn't say, how shall I live? What shall I do? Whom shall I marry? Because they didn't have the means. She becomes a governess, as many women in her circumstances do, that is, without a family, at the time that she becomes a governess, without any means to survive. Common was being a seamstress or a governess or some kind of tutor. As England became more industrial and automated, you might have gotten a job in a factory. If things turned really bad, you might become a prostitute or something close to it. But most women in the period didn't have a choice of life. When she says at the beginning of one of the last chapters, "Reader, I married him," one of the most famous lines in 19th century literature, we're supposed to understand that part of that surprise is she's the one making the choice. She's doing the choosing, which is not typical. So we can note here that this choice of life novel is true also in Great Expectations. Pip has similar choices to make, with an equally stark contrast between possible wives. And in case you've gotten this far in your life without reading Great Expectations, and I'll reserve my pity, I won't tell more about the contrast between those wives until next time. But of course, Dorothea has a choice to make in terms of her husband. And so in a very different way does Tess. Again, the centrality on family, on marriage, on children, even though often the emphasis on children is because of their absence. The 18th century was so committed to the notion of Enlightenment values of reason that many of their works looked at insanity. And the first hospital for treatment of the insane, as they called it, in the 18th century, St. Bethlehem's, which in slang got reduced to Bedlam, is where we get our colloquial expression for a madhouse, for chaos. You can tell something about what a society values by how it works when it's broken. And these novels are filled with broken or fractured families. So, what is the choice she makes? She finds that her own spiritual path requires her to reject St. John's uncompromising and cold Christianity and Mr. Rochester's passionate irreverence. The one suitor has the right Christian values, but doesn't have the passion that Jane wants. And it is, again, a remarkable fact of this novel that in the 1840s, Charlotte is writing a novel where a woman wants passion in her life. And of course, Rochester has all the passion of a Gothic Byronic hero, but not only is he irreverent, he's invited her into what she sees as a decidedly immoral life, and he's lied to her about being married before. So it's not looking good, but it all turns out well. How? Well, Rochester contacts Jane via telepathy, and she responds in kind. If you think I'm being glib, you haven't read the book. That's exactly what's happened. And it's not that either of them imagine it when she comes to meet him after he's broken, he doesn't know what's happened, but she puts the pieces together and realized at just the moment that she heard a voice calling out to her and she responded to him, he heard the same thing. And she worried that in his debilitated state, if she were to share that news with him, it would overwhelm him. So again, not just a narrator telling her own story, but she's managing his life now. She's being the male in the relationship, if I can use that as a shorthand. She returns to Bonfield to see what's going on and finds, by talking to the former butler, that a fire was set by first wife Bertha that killed her. And so that's removed the legal impediment to Jane's marriage to Rochester. So one issue out of the way. That same fire gave Rochester the chance to selflessly rescue all his servants and to try in vain even to save Bertha, who set the fire. And so that removed one of the moral impediments to their marriage. But what of his haughtiness, his mysteriousness, that irreverence? Well, we learn as a result of the fire that there is no longer a house to be lord of, and that its former master has lost one eye, is blind in the other, and has a hand amputated. As the butler tells Jane, he's now helpless, indeed, blind and a cripple. Calm down, ladies, he's spoken for, he's a catch. Jane, Rochester has not been destroyed, but rather burned, maimed, and broken into a better man. You're going to see something very similar in a character who reveals it at the end of Great Expectations. People being humanized by their suffering. And an adult college student, about the age I am now, asked me when I was a young college teacher in my 30s, maybe not even 30, why is it in so many of these novels, people have to be burned or broken into a better shape? She said with real poignancy, can't they just be like nudged into a better shape? Can't they just be kind of like scolded or have their knuckles rapped? Well, they can't. And as a teaser, you come next time and I'll tell you why when we talk about the characters in Great Expectations. So Rochester has not been destroyed, but rather burned, maimed, and broken into a better man who prays that he will be given the strength to lead henceforth a purer life. He has been domesticated, he has been tamed, he has been made conventional, he's been made bourgeois, he's lost any of his aristocratic haughtiness, he's lost his home, he's lost his attitude, if you will. So Jane not only gets a second chance, think of Ebenezer Scrooge, mucking it up for years, being visited by four spirits, sleeping a single night, waking up the next day, and everything's going to be better because the spirits pulled it all off in one night. She gets a second chance, but also with the same man and then the same place, although both the man and the place have been altered. It's as if she's returned and gets a chance to do it over again. This is a pattern in some Jane Austen novels. Pride and Prejudice is a perfect example where there's a setup in the beginning that gets mucked up. And because it is a comedy, it's a comic novel of manners, Elizabeth Bennet gets a second chance and does it right the second time. In Jane Austen's novels, nobody has angst. It doesn't exist. Maybe a headache, maybe dyspepsia. Nobody in Jane Austen's novels is bent, burned, and broken. It just doesn't happen because that's not the world of pre-Victorian England. That's not the kind of novels that Jane Austen is writing. They're comic novels. People may be thwarted, they may be upset, they may be frustrated. Those are novels that also work out well in the end, but they don't have the Gothic, with one exception, and they don't have the element of angst and anxiety. So another thing that has to be said about why it turns out so well at the end and why Jane is able to guide her husband. He eventually gets some sight back. However maimed he is, he has enough virility and anatomy to father a child who, of course, if you had to guess, is a male child who looks just like him. That is a Rochester 2.0. That's part of the comic ending of the novel. Ebenezer gets a second chance and is made into a new man. Rochester is made into a new man who is impaired, but sires a baby that will be a version of him. And Jane Eyre, who has been faithful to her own beliefs, gets a second chance back at the same place with the same guy, except utterly different. That's true of many of these novels. You'll see that Dorothea gets a second chance, and we'll talk about Pip as an exception next time. So I want to say that it does matter, as I said earlier, that Jane now has money. Presumably, Rochester does not have the wealth that he had before, does not have the interest in wealth that he's had before, that even having given away part of her fortune, Jane Eyre is now of a different social station. This is what happens with class. It matters in Great Expectations that Pip has money, that Pip, who is a poor boy, apprenticed to a blacksmith living in the marshlands, an orphan, being raised by his much older sister, who we're told raises him by hand. And what that technically means is she had to bottle feed him because she wasn't a wet nurse. That is, not being raised by his own mother or by a woman who could be a surrogate mother. He was impoverished by having to drink milk out of a bottle. He was fed by hand. But Dickens, always the punster, knows that his sister often beat Pip, and so he was raised by hand in another way. He gets money, and for Dickens, having money, Dickens himself in his own life, is an important virtue. And in Great Expectations, for the first time in his many novels, Dickens seriously considers whether that gospel of getting on, of not only trying to do good, but doing well, might be a mistake. But for Charlotte Bronte and for Jane Eyre, the money is important. And it aligns some of the morality of this novel with Margaret Thatcher and her conservative British government in the 1980s. And I will tell you that I don't often quote Margaret Thatcher, but when I do, it's this quote. When someone asked her why she was always so focused on money and the more wealthy classes, and why she didn't give more of her government's attention to the poor, she answered, no one would remember the Good Samaritan if he had only had good intentions. He had money too. He had money too. And I cite that not to endorse it, but to say that attitude is an underlying impetus in the Victorian novel. When the sponsor of Pip wants to do him a favor, he's going to give him money. When Tess's father thinks that he might have a linkage to an ancient feudal aristocratic family, it's because he wants to have money. That's a very big feature of the Victorian novel. Now, to her credit, Charlotte Bronte, either from her own beliefs or because she wanted the book, which was quite an unusual book in its day, to be well received, it ends not with the birth of the son and that Rochester 2.0. The last paragraphs of the novel concern St. John Rivers, who is unmarried, and we are told will never marry now, as if to say, if not Jane, no one. So a very different outcome for him than for either Rochester or Jane. And we're told by her that he will happily welcome the coming of Lord Jesus. And Lord Jesus are the last two words of the novel. Now, whether that's a nod towards commercial success and keeping a middle class who wants people to be reverent even if they don't believe that Lord Jesus did the things the Bible said, or whether in fact Charlotte Bronte had that bifocal view that she wanted one person in the novel, the central character, to end happily in a marriage. Both of St. John's sisters marry, and wanted a different life to suggest that not all marriages have to happen, not all trajectories end in marriage. I don't know. But an interesting point is that when Jane learns that Rochester heard her voice in chapter 37, when he reports that, she says to us, the reader, I kept these things then and pondered them in my heart. She says that in chapter 37, near the end, before reader, I married him. Well, I kept these things then and pondered them in my heart is a slight reworking of Luke chapter 2, verse 19. But Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. That's what Luke says about Mary after the Christ child has been born and she's visited by the shepherds, and he becomes known in some way to the world. What's striking about that? She doesn't not say it at all. In other words, she could have said, I kept this to myself and thought about it. She alludes to the line by nearly quoting it exactly, but she doesn't quote it. That is, she doesn't say, and I remembered my scripture, and she doesn't cite it, even though, of course, Jane knew what she was doing, and so did Charlotte. And you ask yourself, why would you channel that remarkable line from one of the New Testament and not reference it? If you wanted to keep religion out of it, leave it out. If you want to put it in, why not cite it? The reason was it's this and that. It's having it both ways. It's that middle accommodation. Dear God, if there is a God, save my soul if I have a soul. I'm not saying there is, but if there is, do this. It's not complete rejection, atheism. It's not devotion, religion. It's agnosticism. Maybe, but I can't know. I think that's a perfect example of what critics of the age, that is, students of the age, people, scholars of Victorian literature, think of as the Victorian compromise. That is, I want to show that Jane has this religious dimension to her, but not so far as to quote the passage. Many readers, of course, would have known it anyway. A good example more broadly of the Victorian compromise, and what I mean by that is the adage, honesty is the best policy, originated in the 19th century with shopkeepers having that policy and sometimes even putting it up on a sign in their butcher shop or their retail shop. And what's interesting about that is it doesn't say you should be honest because it will get you to heaven. The most significant word in that adage is policy. If you're honest, you will get more business. That's the compromise. I want to make it clear. I'm not being haughty when I talk about this from the viewpoint of 150 years later. But you can be honest because you think your salvation depends upon it. You can be honest because you think your peace of mind depends upon it. You can be honest not because of any Judeo-Christian credo or the Ten Commandments. You can be honest because you think that's part of the social contract. We owe it to each other to be honest. Policy only comes into it if you're thinking you want to be honest because it's good for business. And that's the Victorian compromise. So I'm going to stop there. I've got about 10 minutes left to our hour and see if Michael has any questions to forward to me. And if we're short on questions, I can preview Great Expectations a bit. If we go long on questions, I'll hold off on that and not spoil any of the plot for you if you haven't read it. So Michael?
Okay, great, Mark. Thanks very much. That was great. We have a couple of questions for starters. Please feel free, folks, to pop them into the Q&A box. So where does Wuthering Heights fit in with the Victorian ethos?
So Wuthering Heights is a true masterpiece. I would go as far as to say that it is the only novel written by an English author in the mid-19th century that rises to the level of a great European classic, the way that the French and German and Russian novels. Most Victorian novels, which I love and admire, and part of my own upbringing and part of what my teaching, my dissertation, my life has been about, are very localized novels. They don't have the kind of operatic scale that you find in German and French, and certainly not in Russian novels, except for Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights is operatic to its core, melodramatic to its core, and it has everything you would want in terms of rank and class, and or whether you live at Wuthering Heights or whether you live at the More Favored Manor, and how Cathy is lost to Heathcliff because he's a gypsy soul and she is co-opted by the upper middle class people. It has all of that, and the vengeance that Heathcliff does by manipulating, getting a fortune and manipulating leases and all of that. But at the same time, at the heart of it is a Gothic romance. The heath, the whole idea of the storm, wuthering, the kind of anti-social background of Heathcliff, even his name, the idea that he's an ultimate outsider. The central image of that novel from the first pages is trying to get in. When the visitor has his first night's sleep visiting, he imagines that there's a ghost at the outside of his window who reaches in saying, "Let me in," and the broken shards of glass cut her wrist. And we find out later that that's the spirit of Cathy that's completely not at rest. Wuthering Heights is a good example of a Victorian novel, and all the way I've been talking about middle class and marriages and class, that doesn't take its Gothicism light.
Great, thank you. Now, this next question, I'll pass it on, even though the answer may be your whole 4-part series, but could you possibly explain how you chose these particular 4 novels?
No, it's not possible to do. I mean, when we're done, maybe it'll make sense to you. Why, the problem is no matter what 4 I pick, you could ask the same question. It's not possible to do, and even if I used all of the 8 minutes remaining. I don't mean that to thwart the person. That's an honest answer. Impossible to answer. They're all great books. It turns out 2 of them are by men, 2 of them by women. They separate out pretty well over the decades of the century, no 2 in the same century. I could say more about how they end, but I don't want to give spoilers, so you'll see there's a variety of patterns. But I could have picked a different 4 and all of that would still be true.
Sure, definitely. So I know you have a separate interest in film also, and after I reread the book this past weekend, I watched.
So Michael, this is your question, not a reader, not a patient.
This is a question for me. Mm-hmm. So after I reread the book over the weekend, I watched the Orson Welles version of the film, and I was just wondering, since I know you have a lot of interest in film, if you could talk about any of the film adaptations. Definitely not as a substitute for reading it by any means, but just as really great entertainment and excellent film.
Yeah, I haven't. I confess that I have not seen the 1944 movie in a long time. Orson Welles as a great Rochester and Joan Fontaine as Jane Eyre. But greater and more memorable is 4 years earlier is the Academy Award-winning Rebecca, where Laurence Olivier plays the mysterious husband. And Joan Fontaine, once again, plays the put upon innocent. That clearly, Daphne du Maurier's source novel clearly borrows heavily from Jane Eyre. Here, the young innocent actually marries a haughty and mysterious man who has been married before. And although the wife is not kept upstairs in the attic, her presence dominates the house so much that she feels she's in competition with it. That's a masterpiece. It may be that the Orson Welles, Joan Fontaine version of Jane Eyre is one too, but I don't have enough of a memory of it.
Got it. Okay, another audience question. Can you speak more about the public and critical reaction to Jane Eyre? Given some of its unorthodox elements, was it at all greeted with anger or concern, or perhaps even banned at any point?
Yeah, I don't know anything about banning. I'm going to say that it's certainly true, as it's true in America now and in public school systems about challenging books, that I'm sure it miffed a lot of people. But in general, it was a tremendous bestseller. The publishing house, which gave her a very bad deal on the book, was ecstatic to get it into print as soon as possible. She went on, unlike her sister Emily, to actually write other novels and have a longer career, even though she died before she was 40. I think most readers, even readers today, unless you really don't like at all the kind of genre of the Victorian novel, find it a very readable and eminently engaging book. There is something very insinuating in a positive sense, very intimate about first-person narration. And it's a fact of first-person narration. It's a kind of literary version. To know someone is to love them. If you love the book, if you like the book, you have to like Jane, because she's the one telling you the story. And one of the contracts we think we're entering into when we read such a book is that Jane is playing fair, that she's doing her best to tell us what is actually true, and she's only withholding information because she also wants to present a good book. We wouldn't want to know in the beginning the secrets that are revealed at the end. So I think most people in the day found it very readable. She also kept up the illusion that this was an autobiography of a woman named Jane Eyre, being edited by someone named Currer Bell, the first name picked to hide the gender. Like her sisters, her first novels were published under a pseudonym. And I think it probably was very, very well received.
Great. Okay, another audience question. Assuming that Bronte's audience would have known the passages from the Bible, many of them anyway, wouldn't it have been unnecessary and maybe even a bit too preachy towards her audience to identify the passages?
Well, it might be preachy, but it wouldn't be odd to say, at that moment, I recalled the line from scripture and then quote it. That would be a very natural thing. And there are many people would say, I don't think she's preaching to me. I don't think she's talking down to me. Very natural thing for someone to say, oh, and I remembered my school learning. She wouldn't have to quote chapter and verse. I think it's a problematic issue. I'll say too, because I see I only have a minute or two, I'll ask a question that I'll answer. And that is the Mad Woman in the Attic. And I'm using that phrase because that became the title back in, I'm going to guess, the 70s, of a monumentally influential scholarly work by two authors whose names I would remember if I were younger, who did a study of how women in Victorian literature are marginalized. That this first wife, who is being treated as insane, is not being treated in some kind of home or healthcare. She's not even being treated in the home. Rochester appears to have the kind of money where he could have her better tended to. She is pushed off in the attic and turned into a kind of ghost presence. And one of the things these two women scholars write about is how you see that type and type and type again in Victorian literature, of course, other literature as well. And it reminds you that the Caribbean author Jean Rhys wrote a great novel called Sargasso Sea, in which it imagines the life in the Caribbean of Bertha before she was taken out of her home and denatured by being brought to England and being displaced. And there's a great deal of interest in the status of women that I will talk more about as the series continues. I would have talked more about it today. I gave glancing references, but I wanted to keep those issues of Gothic and anxiety and family and the skirting with tragedy and ending comically. But Thomas Carlyle, and I'll let this be my last word, I see we're at the top of the hour, great Victorian historian, was married to a woman named Jane Welsh, who probably was absolutely his intellectual equal, a remarkable woman, Jane Welsh Carlyle. And she would write letters to her correspondents. Letter writing was a growing industry, not activity, saying that it was very difficult for her to be married to a great man and to constantly be ignored by the visitors who came to visit them in their home. And she said, I find that I have to say to myself, I too am here. And that title, I too am here, became a published collection of letters and pieces by women authors in the Victorian period, and I think just everyday citizens. I too am here. The interest in respectability and middle-class values, the bourgeois sentiments, meant that a woman's body became a terrain for public debate the way it hadn't been in the 18th century. Why in the 18th century were necklines lower and hemlines higher? Because men weren't policing their women's bodies. Why is a Victorian dress up to the neck and sometimes beyond and down to the ankles? Why were pantaloons, bloomers, after the man who invented them, put on the legs of infant children from their waist down to their ankle? The fear was if you saw a baby's naked leg, it would give you impure thought. Why was the beautiful, elegant curvature of a Queen Anne desk covered in the Victorian period by heavy tablecloths and brocaded drapes and all of that? Because the worry was that if a young person saw the curved leg of an elegant guest, it would put impure thoughts into your head. Well, that's bad enough as it is, but if the victims of that kind of Puritanism are women, that's an issue. And we'll see when we turn to Middlemarch that our friend Dorothea has a good dose of Puritanism in her. Thank you, Michael.
Great. Thanks, Mark. That was a great session. Just want to remind everybody that Mark's happy to answer any questions you have, which you can email him directly. You can, I'll give you his email address if you want it, or I can pass an email along to him, however you'd like to do it. And we had a great turnout tonight, and we'll see everybody next week.
Thank you. Thank you all. See you next time.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everybody for coming.